At dawn in 331 BC, the plain near Gaugamela was already prepared for battle. Darius III had chosen open ground where Persian cavalry could maneuver and scythed chariots could build speed. Dust hung along the horizon as the imperial army spread across a front far wider than Alexander's. The Macedonian king had marched thousands of kilometers into the heart of the Persian Empire. If he failed here, his army could be isolated deep inside enemy territory, with retreat routes threatened and no easy way to replace its losses. Behind Darius stood the resources, cavalry traditions, and manpower of a vast imperial system extending across 3 continents. Alexander's force was smaller, but it was organized as a system. The Macedonian Phalanx held the center with rows of sarissas. The Hypaspists guarded the vulnerable connection between infantry and cavalry. Alexander concentrated the Companion Cavalry on the right, while Thessalian cavalry protected the left under Parmenion. Archers, javelin throwers, and other light troops stood ready to disrupt the Persian chariots. Alexander did not intend to attack the entire imperial line directly. He wanted Darius to move first and open a weakness. As the armies approached, Alexander led his right wing diagonally toward the edge of the battlefield. The movement threatened to carry the Macedonians beyond the ground the Persians had cleared for their chariots. Darius was forced to respond. Persian cavalry extended toward Alexander's right, trying to block the maneuver and prevent an outflanking movement. As more troops shifted outward, the Persian formation began to stretch. Near the center, gaps appeared between units that had originally stood closer together. The Phalanx continued forward, holding the attention of the Persian center. Alexander watched the developing space. Then, with the Companion Cavalry formed into a wedge, he changed direction and drove toward the opening. Hypaspists and nearby infantry supported the advance, turning a gradual sideways movement into a concentrated attack aimed toward the position of Darius himself. The Persian king now faced the danger of a direct breakthrough. As the Macedonian assault approached, parts of the imperial line lost cohesion, and Darius left the battlefield. News of the king's withdrawal weakened confidence across the army, but the Macedonian victory was not yet secure. On the opposite wing, Parmenian's forces remained under intense pressure. Elsewhere, Persian troops had passed through openings in the Macedonian formation and reached the rear. Alexander had found the decisive moment, but his success depended on much more than personal courage. How had a young king with the smaller army defeated the forces of the wealthiest and most extensive empire of his age? The answer begins not with Alexander alone, but with the military machine he inherited from his father, Philip II. Before Philip II, Macedonia was not the dominant military power of the Greek world. The kingdom faced pressure from Illyrian groups in the west, Thracian powers in the east, Greek city-states to the south, and rival claimants within its own royal house. Its aristocracy supplied capable cavalry, but much of the infantry lacked the organization needed for long campaigns. When Philip became king in 359 BC, Macedonia was recovering from a disastrous defeat and appeared vulnerable to invasion or political collapse. Philip responded by changing the relationship between the king and the army. Instead of relying only on forces assembled for short periods, he developed troops who trained regularly, marched together, and remained available for extended campaigns. Units received clearer organization and stronger discipline. Soldiers learned to move with less personal baggage, allowing the army to travel faster and remain in the field longer. Pay, land, rewards, and captured wealth connected military service directly to the authority of the king. Not every reform was entirely new. Philip drew on developments already visible in Greek warfare, but combined them on a larger and more permanent scale. Regular drill allowed infantry to change direction, maintain intervals, and respond to signals under pressure. This transformed separate innovations into a coordinated army capable of repeated campaigning far abroad. The most famous symbol of these reforms was the sarissa, a pike much longer than the traditional spear carried by Greek hoplites. Because it required both hands, the soldier used a smaller shield suspended or supported differently from the large hoplite shield. When a phalanx lowered its weapons, several ranks of sarissa points could project beyond the front line. This created a dense barrier that was extremely difficult to approach from the front and increased the pressure of an organized advance. The weapon also imposed strict limitations. A sarissa was awkward in confined ground and almost useless if an enemy moved inside its effective reach. The phalanx depended on level terrain, close spacing, disciplined movement, and protection for its flanks and rear. If the formation broke apart, individual pikemen were far less secure. Philip's achievement was therefore not simply giving his infantry longer weapons. He built other forces to protect the Phalanx and exploit the pressure it created. The Phalanx was designed to hold enemy troops in place, occupy their attention, and prevent them from moving freely. While opponents struggled against the advancing wall of pikes, the Companion Cavalry could search for an exposed flank or weakened section. These mounted nobles became a decisive striking force rather than merely supporting infantry. The resulting relationship is often described as hammer and anvil. The Phalanx fixed the enemy, while cavalry delivered the concentrated blow. Philip also strengthened the Hypaspists, elite infantry able to move more freely than the Phalanx. They protected the vulnerable space between the slower pikemen and the rapidly moving cavalry, fought on difficult ground, and supported attacks requiring greater flexibility. Archers, javelin throwers, scouts, allied cavalry, and siege engineers added further capabilities. Each arm compensated for weaknesses in the others. By 336 BC, Philip had also established Macedonian leadership over a Greek alliance and was preparing a campaign against the Persian Empire. His assassination placed that army and project in the hands of Alexander. Alexander did not begin with an improvised force. He inherited trained soldiers, experienced officers, organized recruitment, advanced siegecraft, and a military system already tested through years of warfare. His achievement would be to take Philip's machine beyond every previous limit, adapting it across rivers, mountains, fortified cities, deserts, and battlefields stretching from the Aegean coast toward the center of Persian power. Alexander's army was not a single weapon. It was a coordinated system in which heavy infantry, elite guards, cavalry, light troops, engineers, and supply personnel performed different tasks. Its power came from the way those parts supported one another. At the center stood the Macedonian Phalanx, whose infantrymen were called Tyre. They carried the sarissa, a pike far longer than the traditional spear of the Greek hoplite. In battle, several ranks could project their weapons beyond the front line, creating a dense barrier of points. The Phalanx was strongest when moving across open ground in close order. Its soldiers had to keep pace, maintain spacing, lower their sarissas together, and respond to commands. The formation's strength did not depend on individual duels. It depended on thousands of men acting as one body. Yet the Phalanx had limits. It could become disordered on broken terrain, turn slowly, and remain vulnerable on its flanks. If enemy troops entered between separated units or reached the rear, the long sarissa became difficult to use. Alexander treated the Phalanx as the army's fixing force, not as a formation expected to win every battle alone. The decisive attacking arm was the Companion Cavalry. Drawn from the Macedonian aristocracy and organized into squadrons, these riders carried long cavalry spears and were prepared for close combat. Alexander usually concentrated them on the right wing, where he could observe the enemy and lead the main attack. The companions often used a wedge formation. Its narrow point could be directed toward a vulnerable section, while riders behind expanded outward and supported the advance. The formation allowed changes of direction more easily than a straight line. Alexander's presence near the front helped him recognize the moment when pressure from the Phalanx or movement by the enemy created an opening. Between the Phalanx and the Companion Cavalry stood the Hypaspists. These elite infantrymen performed the army's most demanding role. They protected the right flank of the Phalanx, followed rapid cavalry advances, guarded positions, and fought on ground where the tightly ordered sarissa formation was less effective. Without them, a dangerous space could appear whenever Alexander's cavalry moved faster than the infantry center. The Hypaspists acted as a flexible connection between those two forces. They also joined assaults on fortified locations and sometimes operated close to the king, although their precise equipment and organization remained debated. On the left wing, Thessalian cavalry carried the burden of defense. While Alexander searched for a decisive opportunity on the right, the Thessalians and allied horsemen had to resist Persian cavalry, prevent encirclement, and buy time. Their task could require withdrawal, repeated counterattacks, and the discipline to hold without drawing the entire army out of position. This role was less dramatic than Alexander's charges, but it was essential. A breakthrough on the left could threaten the Phalanx, the camp, and the army's rear before the Companion Cavalry completed its own attack. Light troops formed a vital layer. Agrianian javelin throwers, Cretan archers, slingers, scouts, and skirmishers moved ahead of or beside the heavier formations. They harassed enemy cavalry, targeted horses, guarded rough ground, protected the flanks, and pursued forces that had lost order. At Gaugamela, troops of this kind helped disrupt the Persian scythe chariots before those vehicles could break the phalanx. Their mobility also allowed them to fight in hills, riverbanks, and confined spaces where the main infantry formation could not deploy effectively. Alexander's army was equally dangerous outside open battle. Engineers and craftsmen built siege towers, ramps, bridges, artillery platforms, and fieldworks. They operated stone-throwing machines, arrow-firing artillery, and battering equipment. During the siege of Tyre, Macedonian forces constructed a causeway from the mainland toward the island city. When parts of it were destroyed, they rebuilt the approach and combined it with naval forces and siege machinery. Such operations required more than courage. Surveyors selected routes, carpenters shaped timber, metalworkers repaired fittings, and laborers moved stone and earth. Engineering allowed Alexander to overcome obstacles that neither the phalanx nor cavalry could solve. Behind every campaign stood logistics. Soldiers needed grain, water, replacement weapons, sandals, medical care, and payment. Horses required fodder, equipment, and rest. Pack animals carried supplies, while captured cities and local storehouses provided food and money. Alexander reduced unnecessary baggage to preserve speed, but this created dependence on secure roads, friendly settlements, and accessible supplies. A fast army could surprise opponents, yet it could not remain effective if its animals weakened or its food routes failed. Command completed the system. Alexander relied on officers such as Parmenion, Craterus, Coenus, Hephaestion, and Philotas to control separate sections of the army. These men could maintain pressure, organize reserves, and respond when the king was leading cavalry elsewhere. Alexander was the commander, but he did not fight or think for every soldier. His army worked because trained units and experienced officers could execute different missions at the same time. The Macedonian war machine was powerful not because one formation was unbeatable. It was powerful because the phalanx held, the Hypaspes connected, light troops disrupted, engineers opened roads and walls, and cavalry struck at the decisive point. In 334 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia. The expedition was dangerous. His force was too small to conquer the Persian Empire through numbers alone, so success depended on speed, discipline, supplies, and repeated victories. A serious defeat could leave the Macedonians trapped, while Persian naval forces threatened the coast behind them. Alexander's first battle came at the Granicus River in northwestern Anatolia. Persian satraps had gathered cavalry and infantry near the crossing, hoping to stop the invasion before it gained momentum. The river and its banks complicated any attack. Mounted troops moving through water could lose speed and formation, while soldiers climbing the opposite bank would be vulnerable before establishing stable ground. Ancient sources disagree about the precise timing and sequence, but they agree that Alexander chose an aggressive crossing. Macedonian cavalry entered the river under pressure from Persian horsemen near the bank. The current, uneven ground, and crowded approach made organized movement difficult. Alexander joined the cavalry struggle, while other mounted units widened the attack and prevented the Persians from concentrating against one point. Once Macedonian cavalry gained space on the far side, the phalanx and supporting infantry increased the pressure. Persian cavalry could no longer hold the crossing, and the line began to give way. Granicus was not the destruction of the Persian Empire, but it gave Alexander the initiative in Asia Minor. It demonstrated that Persian provincial commanders and their experienced cavalry could be defeated in open battle. After Granicus, Alexander moved through western Anatolia, receiving the surrender of some cities and fighting for others. His strategy was shaped by a problem at sea. The Persian Empire possessed a powerful fleet, while Alexander's initial naval position was weaker. Instead of seeking an immediate naval battle, he attacked coastal bases that Persian ships required for supplies, shelter, and communication. By controlling ports and cities along the eastern Mediterranean, Alexander could weaken Persian naval operations from the land. This protected his connections with Macedonia, reduced the risk of a Persian counterattack into Greece, and gave him access to additional ships and resources. The conquest depended on sieges, diplomacy, and control of roads as much as victories in open battle. In 333 BC, Darius III personally entered the campaign. The two armies met near Issus, where mountains and the sea restricted the battlefield. The narrow ground prevented the Persians from using the full width of their larger army. Darius placed infantry near the center. concentrated strong cavalry toward the coastal side, and positioned himself behind the central line. Alexander led the Macedonian right against the Persian left. The Phalanx advanced across difficult ground and through the river, but its formation did not remain perfectly connected. Gaps opened, and Greek mercenary infantry serving Darius placed severe pressure on the Macedonian center. On the opposite wing, Persian cavalry attacked the Thessalians and allied horsemen, creating a battle that remained dangerous for Alexander's army. The decisive movement came on the Macedonian right. After breaking through the forces before him, Alexander did not continue chasing troops away from the main battle. He turned the Companion Cavalry inward toward the Persian center and the position of Darius. The threat was political as well as tactical. The Persian king served as the visible center of command for an army drawn from many regions. When his position became endangered, Darius withdrew from the battlefield. His departure weakened coordination and morale, and sections of the Persian force began to retreat. Alexander had won another victory, but the empire had not fallen. Darius escaped and could raise new forces. His family and parts of the royal household were captured, yet Persian naval power and coastal cities remained active. Alexander could not safely march straight into the imperial heartland, while strong positions behind him threatened his routes. Granicus and Issus revealed the pattern of the campaign. The Phalanx created pressure. Light troops and allied cavalry protected vulnerable areas, and Alexander concentrated the companions where a breakthrough could have the greatest effect. But before he could force a final confrontation with Darius, he first had to secure the coast, break Persian naval influence, and overcome one of the strongest island cities in the Mediterranean world, Tyre. In 332 BC, Alexander reached Tyre, one of the strongest cities on the eastern Mediterranean coast. Tyre stood offshore behind high walls and possessed a fleet supporting Persian naval operations. Leaving it unconquered would place a hostile base behind Alexander, while he advanced toward Egypt and the imperial heartland. Yet the weapons that had won open battles could not solve this problem. A phalanx could not march across the sea, and cavalry could not charge an island fortress. Alexander answered with engineering. He ordered a causeway built from the mainland toward the city. Soldiers and laborers carried stone, timber, and earth into the water, while Tyrian defenders attacked from the walls and from ships. Siege towers protected the workers, but the project moved into deeper water and became increasingly exposed. The Tyrians launched a fire ship that damaged the causeway and destroyed part of the siege equipment. Alexander expanded the operation. As Phoenician and Cypriot fleets joined him, he gained the naval strength to blockade Tyre. Engineers rebuilt the causeway, widened it, and brought new towers and artillery forward. Ships carrying battering equipment attacked the walls from several directions. After months of resistance, Macedonian forces opened a breach and entered the city. Tyre showed that Alexander's army could adapt when phalanx and cavalry were not enough. With Tyre captured, Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean lost a major base. Alexander continued south, secured Egypt, and protected the western side of his campaign. He gained food, money, ports, and political authority before turning northeast toward the central territories of the Persian Empire. Darius III was also preparing. He assembled forces from across the empire and selected a broad plain near Gaugamela for the decisive confrontation in 331 BC. Unlike the narrow ground at Issus, this battlefield allowed Persian cavalry to spread across both wings. The surface was prepared so that scythed chariots could move without being stopped by rough ground. Darius intended to use space, mobility, and the width of his army to surround the smaller Macedonian force. Alexander expected that danger. He placed the phalanx in the center, Hypaspes and Companion Cavalry on the right, and Thessalian and allied cavalry on the left. Light troops screened the front. Behind the main line stood a second formation that could turn around, close gaps, defend the camp, or meet Persian troops breaking through the rear. The Macedonian army was arranged not only to advance, but to respond in several directions. When the Persian chariots moved forward, Alexander's light troops attacked the drivers and horses with arrows and javelins. Some Macedonian units opened lanes, allowing chariots to pass through without shattering the phalanx. Troops behind the front then surrounded vehicles that had lost momentum. The chariots created disruption, but they did not produce the collapse Darius required. The main cavalry struggle developed on Alexander's right. He continued moving diagonally outward, threatening to leave the ground Darius had prepared. Persian cavalry shifted to block him, stretching the left side of the imperial formation. Fighting intensified as both armies contested the outer edge. Alexander was forcing the Persians to extend their line and commit mobile troops farther from Darius. As units moved outward, a space appeared between the Persian left and center. This was the opportunity Alexander had been seeking. He turned the Companion Cavalry inward, formed them into a wedge, and drove toward the opening. Hypaspists and nearby infantry advanced beside the cavalry, protecting the attack and connecting it to the Phalanx. The Macedonian thrust did not try to defeat every Persian unit at once. It aimed where a breakthrough could threaten command, coordination, and morale together. Darius stood near the center, as the visible leader of an army assembled from many regions. When Alexander's attack approached, the Persian king withdrew from the battlefield. His departure weakened the imperial center, but the battle did not end everywhere at once. On the Macedonian left, Parmenian and the Thessalian cavalry remained under heavy pressure. Elsewhere, Persian cavalry passed through gaps in the Macedonian line and reached the rear. Alexander began pursuing Darius, then turned back when support was needed on the opposite wing. Gaugamela was not a simple charge followed by instant victory. The Macedonian formation was stretched. Sections fought separate battles, and success depended on experienced officers maintaining control while Alexander moved between opportunities and crises. By the end, the Persian army had lost the field, and Darius could no longer protect the central capitals. Alexander entered Babylon and Susa, gaining access to treasuries and administrative centers. He then advanced toward Persepolis, a ceremonial center of Achaemenid power. These conquests gave him wealth, supplies, legitimacy, and control over the empire's western core. Darius continued east, hoping to organize resistance, but his authority weakened. In 330 BC, he was seized by men from his own side and later died during their retreat. Alexander pursued those responsible while presenting himself as Darius's successor and avenger. Tyre and Gaugamela were different achievements. Tyre showed engineering endurance and the ability to combine land and naval forces. Gaugamela showed tactical flexibility, layered deployment, disciplined light troops, and concentrated cavalry attack. Together, they opened the road from the Mediterranean to the Persian capitals. Alexander had not defeated an empire with one weapon or one charge. He used every part of the Macedonian military system to overcome a fortress at sea and an imperial army on open ground in careful coordination. Alexander did not destroy the Persian Empire with the Phalanx alone. His victories came from a military system in which each arm performed a different task and protected the weaknesses of the others. The Phalanx held enemy infantry in place. Hypaspis guarded the vulnerable connection between the center and the cavalry. Light troops disrupted horses, chariots, and exposed flanks. Engineers opened roads, crossed rivers, and reduced fortified cities. Then the Companion Cavalry delivered the concentrated attack at the point where resistance was already beginning to weaken. This coordination gave Alexander more than raw strength. It gave him flexibility. If the battlefield was narrow, he could use terrain to limit Persian numbers. If the enemy extended its line, he could attack the gap. If cavalry threatened one wing, allied horsemen and reserves could delay it. If walls blocked the advance, engineers and siege machines replaced open battle. The army did not depend on one perfect formation. It could change its methods while preserving a common plan. Speed was equally important. Alexander often forced Persian commanders to respond before they had fully concentrated their forces. He crossed rivers aggressively, moved rapidly between regions, and exploited victories before opponents could recover. After Granicus, he secured cities and supply routes. After Issus, he continued along the coast rather than allowing Persian naval power to remain behind him. After Gaugamela, he moved quickly toward Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, turning battlefield success into control of money, roads, and administration. His tactical objectives were clear. Alexander did not need to defeat every soldier at once. He focused on the point where a breakthrough could create the greatest effect: the connection between units, an exposed flank, a weakened cavalry formation, or the position of the commander. At Issus and Gaugamela, threatening Darius produced consequences far beyond the immediate fighting. Once the king withdrew, coordination weakened, and confidence fell across an army assembled from many regions. Alexander also benefited from experienced officers and veterans created under Philip II. Commanders such as Parmenian, Craterus, Coenus, Hephaestion, and Philotas could control separate sections while Alexander led the main cavalry attack. Years of shared campaigning allowed units to respond when plans changed or parts of the formation became separated. The Persian Empire was not weak, primitive, or incapable of resistance. It possessed wealth, roads, strong cavalry, experienced soldiers, and enormous resources, but its size created difficulties. Forces had to be gathered from distant territories. Regional commanders had their own interests. Communication took time, and the withdrawal of the king could damage the unity of the whole army. When central authority weakened, some governors chose surrender or cooperation rather than continued resistance. Alexander's genius was not inventing every part of the Macedonian war machine. Philip had created its foundations. Alexander's achievement was knowing when to hold, when to maneuver, and where to concentrate force. The Phalanx fixed the enemy. The Hypaspes protected the gap. Light troops created disorder. Cavalry struck the decisive point. Persian power fell because Alexander used all of them together.